I'd like to introduce you to a presentation that was developed at Lives Live Well by Michele Campbell and myself, Gerard Moloney. And this was presented to various groups of staff in Lives Live Well. The main theme of the presentation was looking at loss and grief and how much of that is impacting us during this period of COVID-19. The main points we looked at were shock, loss, and grief. So what we will cover today, moving on, what we will cover today is understanding the shock responses to sudden loss, understanding some of the aspects of collective and disenfranchised grief, looking briefly at anticipatory grief, and then finally some thoughts on ambiguous grief as presented through the work of Pauline Boss, and then some final words. So our next slide is a quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she worked mainly during the 1960s, 70s and 80s and came to be seen as a bit of a touch point for loss and for grief. And Kubler-Ross did most of her early work working with people who were facing terminal illness and facing death through terminal illness. So a lot of her work was done with people before they died. And then she discovered that a lot of what she had worked on there and identified was also applicable to people during the grieving process after family members or loved ones had passed away through death. Now, what she said is that any natural, normal human being, when faced with any kind of loss, will go from shock all the way through to acceptance. So one of the key points that she's making here is that grief, loss, they're natural processes. They're not pathological. If we get stuck in them for any great length of time, it may become pathological, but mostly it's not. It's a natural, normal process. Shock is the first response to sudden loss. For many people, shock can be seen in car accidents and other accidental happenings that happen, other accidents that happen when there's sudden loss. And it can be the sudden loss of the ability to do the job you love. It can be the death of a loved one. But the shock is a normal response to sudden loss. And one of the ones which we're often familiar with is car accidents, where there is a shock at actually having been in the accident. And sadly, there are many occasions where people get out of car accidents only to be hit by another car when they walk back out on the road. And often that's been seen to be a bit of an indication that the person was in shock. And when we're in shock, we're not aware of our surroundings as we usually are. And so we can be just so relieved to survive an accident that we get out and don't look, we don't see, we don't even hear other traffic on the road. And so emergency services workers like police and ambulance officers are very keen to keep an eye on people when they're coming out of accidents, that they can shepherd them off to the side of the road. So sadly, we read about that in papers or on the news, we hear about it. So shock is something that happens to us. It's a natural response to loss. And what I want to talk about here is that sometimes we are completely unaware that we are in shock when it happens to us. We don't notice it, and we need others to assist us, to support us, to be able to identify that that's what's happening for us. I think during this period of COVID-19, that at times the shock that we've all experienced there has not been recognised. And I'm just going to talk now about a few elements that sometimes can be indicators of this loss. The first is that we feel numb. We feel a bit scrambled. And with that comes a sense that we have nothing to give. There's a sense of emptiness within us. And as a result of that emptiness, we can think we've got nothing to give, when that's not quite the truth, but that's what the feeling, the experience is. And as a result of that, we become unwilling to try or even to contribute. So you might notice this happening to yourself, or you might notice it in your family, you might notice it among your staff. So be aware that this may well be a shock response you're observing. It's not that the person doesn't want to give, it's just that they are in this shock and they don't even know that they're unwilling. Another element of it is fear. And when fear becomes the dominant driver, it takes over our decision making. Any other emotion can do that as well, but fear, especially when it is dominant, it takes over our decision making. And if we're in shock, we're not aware that fear is driving us as much as it actually is. So this is really key to note, that if we're noticing these sort of responses in our staff or in our colleagues, that we can support them and help maybe just raise a thought to them that maybe they need to take a bit of time to reflect and to consider, are they okay? On to the next slide. We're looking there at the next lot, is that sometimes a shock response is indicated when a person becomes fixated on a belief. They get really fixated and they become louder and louder and are less receptive to different points of view. So as a result, people don't inquire into things. They don't look at alternatives. And they become really fixed in their thinking. That's one end of the scale. The other end of the scale in our thinking is that we become so confused we don't know what our beliefs are. So we become sort of all mixed up and all a bit of a hodgepodge. So both of those may be indicators that in our mind and in our belief, we're actually showing signs of shock. And another one is when we escape into substances, abuse, violence, gossip. We get caught up in all that field to try to quieten our minds and bodies to manage this experience of shock. So for us in an organisation such as Lives Live Well, where we're dealing with people who come to us for support with their alcohol and drug or gambling or mental health issues, that we need to be aware that some of our clients may well be triggered into relapse in the work they're doing with us because of this shock experience they've experienced during this COVID-19 time. If there was only one shock, then that would be simple enough. But often when these shocks come, and COVID-19 has brought many shocks, in that it's been a shock to our way of life, to our connection with each other. Many people have lost their jobs. Many people have lost confidence that they can pay their bills. And some have lost their jobs, lost their income, and are now dependent on unemployment benefits and so on. So those shocks, often you get multiple shocks that have been happening during this period. So you may get several of these responses coming from people. So one of the articles that we've referenced, put in the references to this presentation, is the question, it started off with, is what we're feeling grief? And I suppose it depends on how we define grief. For myself, grief is a response to loss. It is a response that has physical, emotional, and I would also say mental, as well as spiritual elements to it. And so grief is a process by which we regather our balance after a significant loss. At the moment, it's not just one or two people who are experiencing this loss. It's as if our whole community are going through this ongoing and changeable situation, and we're all going through it together. So usually when grief is happening in a family or in a community, there are some people who are experiencing it and others can support them. But during this period, there is all of us are feeling this grief to some degree, but we may not be aware that that's what's happening for us. So some of the terminology that's been used is moving on to the next slide, is collective and disenfranchised grief. So this researcher, whose name I will bypass, says that the element of yearning for something is what sets grief apart from other emotional responses such as depression or stress. So this yearning for what once was. And so I'm sure in the last few months we've heard ourselves, oh, I wish it was like it was, wish we could get back to normal, I wish we could do this. And sometimes, that's a real key indicator that grief is happening for us. Then we come to the realization that things may never be the same again. We don't know what normal is or what normal will be. And I suppose at this current climate where we are now at the beginning of June, we are still not sure what normal will look like, but we know that things are starting to return a bit away from the extremes in which we've been living in for the last couple of months. The other thing that complicates it a bit here, and what I'd mentioned before, is that we are grieving here on so many levels. This article talked about micro and macro losses. So micro losses are being ones that are personal and perhaps what we would say private to us. And the macro ones are the societal ones that we're experiencing, that we're all experiencing as a society. The other thing is that some of those macro losses are regarding our employment. Some of us have managed to, with great gratitude, maintain a job during this period, whereas others, large numbers of people, have not been able to. So those losses are quite significant, and they're not just personal, they're actually societal, because as a society, we are dealing with a lot of people who are unable to support themselves in the usual way that they do. But I suppose the key point for these is that grief is a natural and healthy response to loss. But at the moment, because there are so many different losses and the interaction of those losses, it's often difficult to say, God, whether this is actually a natural and healthy response. It doesn't feel very comfortable. So we tend to think there must be something wrong with us. And this is a key element to support people to normalise and to see that grief is a natural and healthy response. Another thing that comes up, especially when fear is involved, and we're moving on now to the next section regarding anticipatory grief. So anticipatory grief is where the mind is going into the future. It's a grief about what we could lose or what we might lose, but the reality has not yet come to us. So we're preparing ourselves, we're bracing ourselves. But we tend to look forward and imagine the worst. And the key to helping us deal with this sort of grief is to come back into the present. How can I anchor myself in the day, to look out at the sky, to be aware of the chair I'm sitting in, to be aware of the room I'm in, or whether I'm outside in nature? So part of this is coming back into the present. Because when this sort of grief gets going, we're looking at what we could lose and how that might impact us in the worst case scenario. So we tend to awfulize or catastrophize things. So what some of the research is saying is that many people at the moment during this COVID-19 period are experiencing this subtle, and I would say it's probably more than subtle, it's a keen sense of grief, and it becomes a chronic ongoing stress. It's not just something we feel for a day or two, but all the changes, all the different things that we've been through as a community in the last few months, they're all subtle and not so subtle experiences of anticipating what the future might be like. So because of the uncertainty about the future, this uncertainty seems to just keep on going. Even at the moment when things are a little bit more certain and we're feeling a little bit more comfortable, there is still the uncertainty of what might come tomorrow. The key to this is acceptance of this is the current reality in which we're living, and that we can find a way through this, that there is hope that we can deal with this. And this is where we regain our power, where we actually start to feel we have some capacity to manage our life. And the key for that is to find balance in the way we think. And when we find ourselves getting too far into the future, that we need to just bring ourselves back to the present. Or if we look too far back into the past, again, we bring ourselves back into the present. So the key factor here with this sort of grief is to stay in the present and to breathe and to calm ourselves in the present. So Lukens, who's another researcher in this territory, suggests that the signs about anticipatory grief fit into these following signs, and they're on the next slide. Sometimes people just appear irritable. They seem a bit detached, a bit removed, or they're speaking more negatively than normal, or they become preoccupied about things when normally they wouldn't be preoccupied. There's less laughter. There is more tiredness. And sometimes there's discussion about how much they've drunk today or last night, and it comes through pretty clear that they're drinking like this every night. So people are resorting to ways to distract, to kill the pain, to dampen things down. So there's some of the signs that you might notice in yourself or in others, and they might indicate that this anticipatory grief is happening for you. I'd like to move on now to ambiguous grief. And this was developed and identified, the concept of this concept was identified by a woman called Pauline Boss, who did a lot of work in family therapy in the US. And this was especially after the Vietnam War, where the American military had lots of lost in action pilots over Vietnam. And so after about 10 years, the insurance companies, without any knowledge of whether these men were still alive or whether they had died, insurance companies began to want to contact families and to want the person to be declared deceased, and that they would then pay out the insurance. And the families resisted this because they said, if you do that, you will take away our hope. So Pauline Boss explored this, and what she identified was that what this type of loss is, what's clear about it, is that it's very ambiguous. It's a loss that remains unclear due to uncertainty and lack of knowledge. So this lack of clarity. And this, I think, is a key to what we're feeling at the moment during this COVID-19 period. There is this ambiguity and it's ongoing, and while it might lessen at times, there seems to be no end in sight. And she identified that this type of loss traumatizes individuals and families. And if they've been traumatized by an event already, such as the loss of someone out of that family with no real clear certainty about whether they're alive or dead, then this actually blocks the grief process. So she talked about two types, and the initial type she identified was people who are physically absent but psychologically present, such as when people leave without saying goodbye, or there were never any goodbyes and then the person is never seen again. And this happens a lot with missing persons. And missing in action from military events is a key part of that. The other one that she described at a later stage was where people are physically present yet psychologically absent. They say goodbye, but they haven't left the house. So these are people, especially with Alzheimer's or types of condition where their mental capacity deteriorates and there's no recognition of the person, and there's no recognition of, say, especially close relationships as between partners, husbands and wives, and family members. So these are very difficult places to be in, and the ambiguity just remains on day after day, especially in some of the latter cases where people can live on with some sort of Alzheimer's or loss of capacity to know others for long periods of time. So the thing about that Pauline Boss identified was that this ambiguity freezes the grief process. It stops the recognition that grief is happening. And it also blocks the coping and decision-making processes that people normally take. And as a result of this, closure is impossible. There is no end in sight. So as a result, people are frozen in a state of coping and grieving. It just perpetuates itself on and on. And if there's no one to be able to help people to identify this or recognize this, then it's very difficult in this process. Moving on to the next slide. So as a result, people have no choice but to live with the paradox of absence and presence, the ambiguity of feeling the absence and yet feeling the presence. And this ambiguity tends to rupture the meaning of loss. It's difficult to believe that the loss is real because there's this sort of hope that it's not. So without meaning, there is no hope. So you've got this mixture of being hopeful, but of not experiencing hope. There just seems to be no end in sight. And the other thing is that other people usually feel very uncomfortable in this space, or they feel very uncomfortable with the energy that's in a family who's experiencing this ambiguous grief. And as a result, they don't tend to visit as much. And so people and families often feel even more alone than what they normally do during a period of grief. And the other key factor she pointed out was that there are no social patterns or rituals to deal with this sort of grief. This ongoing grief, it just perpetuates. So this type of ambiguous grief, I think, is something which we may well have felt a lot of in recent months with the COVID-19 events and with all the events that have become associated with it. It's even more the case for families and people who have had other significant losses in the lead up to COVID-19. And further, I think culturally, from a point of view here in Australia, where many of people in this country have migrated to Australia during their current lifetime, or they are the children of migrants, that they have family members in other parts of the world. So during this time of so much uncertainty, or even not being able to connect easily with their families overseas, that this ambiguous grief is a really critical point to understand for how people are managing the separation that they're feeling at this time, especially when they are unable to make any travel or connection with family in different parts of the world. And the other thing we know about Australians too is that often many parents in Australia have adult children who are now working overseas for various periods of time. So there's also that ambiguity around when they will meet again and when they might not meet. So let's just be aware of that as part of the current climate. So this can be happening for us as individuals, but it also can be happening to our colleagues in the organisations in which we work or in the areas in which we live. So some final words now before we finish this presentation, and that is the point is can I let go of what I can't control? To be able to distinguish between the bits I can have some management of and the bits I can't change at all, and to let them go. The next thing is to stock up on compassion, and the compassion needs to start at home. It's a bit like putting on your own mask first in those airline commercials or those airline safety briefings when you first get on a plane, even though we haven't been on one for a while recently. So it's look after yourself, stock up on compassion for yourself so that you can pass that compassion on to others. It's probably advisable to overprotect rather than to overreact, to be empathetic, concerned, connected to others as best you can, even if that's not able to happen in a physical way. And finally, it's to let the emotion flow, to let grief happen, and then to keep going. That sometimes we feel that if the emotion is expressed, we will not be able to do anything. But it's amazing that when we express the emotion, it gives us an energy and a capacity to keep going and to keep dealing with what's in front of us especially as we're looking after our families and ourselves, maybe our elderly parents, or other people in our street that need some support. So let's encourage each other to let the grief happen, to honour the grief as it happens, but to keep going about our daily tasks to the best of our capacity. The final slide moves on and gives some references. So feel you can look at those references and connect into them, and to find more information about how you might look at grief, especially for yourself, for your family, and perhaps if you work in the space like we do here in Lives Live Well, for how we might support our clients. Thank you.